For our meditation, shall we turn to the book of Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 13, and read verse 5. Judges chapter 13, verse 5.
For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines.
Praise the Lord. Just a brief introduction about this book. This book is called Judges because it tells us the history of the different judges that God raised to rule His people, to lead His people. There were times we know God raised leaders like Moses and Joshua, but after the death of Joshua, there were no kings as yet. So in that brief period, God raised up 13 judges to rule His people. And this book is all about their history, and it contains 7 times where God's people backslid and went away from Him, 7 apostasies, and 7 times of servitude or slavery to 7 different nations. A study of this book will make us understand how important it is to have leaders and how important it is to submit to the will of God. And there was this dark period in Israel when there were no leaders, and about such a time, one day an angel appeared to a woman and spoke the words that we just read. Now these words were spoken to this woman whose name remains a mystery. One Jewish chronologer claims that her name was Hazelelponi, quoting 1 Chronicles chapter 4 verse 3, saying from his calculations she must be this woman, but we just do not know. But the name of her husband has been recorded here as Manoah. Manoah means rest, and it's the same as Noah. So her husband was Manoah, and the only thing that we know about both of them were that they belonged to the tribe of Dan. They both belonged to this tribe of Dan, and this woman in particular was barren. She had no children. She was incapable of having a child, and only a miracle could give her a child. And here was a messenger of God giving her a promise that she would bear a son. And he was going to be a very special son. From these words we understand that the son was going to be a Nazarite. When she heard those words, she understood that her son would have to grow up very different from all other children, because he had a special calling upon his life. Why God chose to give such a special son to these parents is what we must understand. As parents, sometimes we fail to understand the plan of God concerning us and our children. We think that our children are gifts of God to us. When we have a child, we say, "Oh, God gave me this gift." It is true. God gave you the gift of a child. But sometimes you must learn to look at it the right way. God did not give you your children as a gift. God gave your children a gift, and that gift is you. Just imagine your children were given to another set of parents who were not Christians. Just imagine God gave your children to parents who were enemies of God. Well, even in that case, we have seen so many believers here whose parents are not saved, but God has brought them. But thank God, He gave your children to you. Here He has promised this mother a child. But actually, why did he choose these parents? One thing about them we must admire: they were a very united family. Something very beautiful. They trusted each other, and there was such peace in their home. If you read this chapter, you understand when the angel spoke to her and she went and said, a man of God came and said this to me. The husband didn't think, look, I am the head of the house. The message should have come to me, not to you. Already you're sitting on my head, and now this message came to you. Now I don't know what to do. He didn't think like that. Immediately he humbled himself and said, Lord, if this is from you, can you send that man again? And if you read this chapter, you see how that man reappeared. And when he appeared again, he reappeared in the absence of Manoah. He appeared only to the wife. And the wife, of course, she never acted independent. When he appeared again, she said, wait, ran and called her husband and said, come, he has come. This time again, Manoah ran. And we can understand how united they were. Indeed, God gave this special Nazarite boy to them because they were a very united couple. It is so important for father and mother to be united, for the children to be brought up well. But that is not the focus of my message. Unity is something we have focused upon, and we will be always touching upon it because it is a very important thing. But we need to understand something more from the life of this family. This term Nazarite, it comes from a Hebrew word, Nazar. The Hebrew word Nazar means separated or consecrated. I always wanted to share this with you, and I was so surprised when the Spirit of God put this in my heart yesterday to share last night. Now this term Nazarite means separated or consecrated, and we know the word consecrated means belonging to God. When you consecrate something to the Lord, it means this thing does not belong to anyone but to God. It is sacred and only God must use it. So Nazarite, the word Nazarite means that. Now, among the Hebrew people, anyone could take this vow of a Nazarite. It was not restricted to a particular tribe like the priesthood. Anyone could be a Nazarite if he was poor or rich, a man, a woman, a master or slave. They were all free to be Nazarites. There was no restriction on how long they had to be a Nazarite. For some it could be 30, for another 60 days, to some others 90 or even 100 days. The scripture names only three men who were Nazarites for life. Do you know their names? Three names. In this case, we know who the special child is. His name is Samson. Okay, Samson is a Nazarite. John the Baptist, Jesus Christ. Alright. I didn't expect you to give the wrong answer, but sadly you did. So I have to give you the correct answer. Jesus Christ was not a Nazarite. He was a Nazarene. And he was called a Nazarene because he came from Nazareth. Jesus was not a Nazarite. He did not keep the Nazarite vow. As you will study, he had to break the vow. One of the three conditions of a Nazarite is do not touch a dead body. But Jesus had to touch dead bodies to raise them to life. The third Nazarite was Samuel. Samuel, Samson, and John the Baptist were three Nazarites who were Nazarites for life. Now, all these three Nazarites were set apart as Nazarites before their birth itself. John the Baptist and Samson were set apart as Nazarites by the voice of an angel, and Samuel was set apart by his own mother. 1 Samuel chapter 1 makes us understand about Hannah's dedication. In chapter 1 verse 11, we read how she decided to give her son as a Nazarite to God. Well, you don't have to read it, we do not have time, but if you can just go to the second half of it.
Then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head.
Here Hannah was dedicating her son to be a Nazarite to God for his life, for his entire life. John the Baptist also, we see, was going to be a Nazarite. In Luke's Gospel chapter 1 verse 15, we read, "He shall be great in the sight of the Lord, he shall drink neither wine nor strong drink," meaning he should avoid alcohol and avoid even grape juice. And he shall be filled with the Holy Ghost even from his mother's womb. So these were special Nazarites from their womb to their tomb. They were called to be Nazarites. Now, apart from them, there were other Nazarites whose identities are not known, but the Bible makes us understand that there were such Nazarites. You can just write down as reference for those of you who are keen to know it. Lamentations chapter 4 verse 7 and Amos chapter 2 verse 11. Lamentations 4:7 and Amos 2:11. It makes us understand there were other Nazarites apart from these. Now, this Nazarite vow that these children took and kept made them or turned them into extraordinary men. They were mighty in strength and they were mightily used by God. When we think of Samuel, he was not an ordinary judge. He was the last judge of Israel, and he was the first to anoint the first king. He was a prophet, he was a priest. As a child, he learned to hear the voice of God, and he grew up as a prophet, and people trembled at his words. There was something so extraordinarily special about him. 2 books have been devoted to him. When we think of Samson and the extraordinary feats, his strength was superhuman. It was not the strength of a man. And we know that his strength also came from his Nazarite consecration. But more than these two, it was the third Nazarite, John the Baptist, who was outstanding. From the words of Jesus himself in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, verse 11, we understand that. Matthew 11:11. It tells us that John the Baptist was the greatest of all three Nazarites.
Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist, notwithstanding he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he.
He that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Jesus is saying John the Baptist is the greatest Nazarite till now. And yet a believer of the New Testament church who is going to New Jerusalem is greater than John the Baptist. So now you understand why you are hearing this message. This message is not to understand how high John the Baptist was or how high a Nazarite was. This message is to show you that we are called to a higher life and they have to be under us. Now, what was the purpose of raising such Nazarites in the Old Testament and in the Bible? Why did God raise up such Nazarites? You can imagine a Nazarite boy. He had to study. He went to school. He probably came to the congregation of Israel, like coming to church. But there was something very different about this boy. What was different about him? His consecration. When others looked at him, they would see him as a different person. What the difference was, we will study later. But there was a purpose for this. And as he grew up, he became a teenager, he became a young man, and he would still be in that consecration. Every time a father or a mother or an Israelite looked at this Nazarite, immediately, what was their reaction? This Nazarite was a man who was very obedient to God. He was keeping that obedience. So every time they saw him, they were reminded of their own disobedience. They were reminded of their own rebellion. See, for example, if you look at another believer who is praying and praying and really pouring out their hearts and praying, when you see that, what happens? You feel, oh gosh, I wish I could pray like that. I don't pray like that. When you hear of a believer whom God has convicted and cleansed and is doing a deep work, then we are reminded of our own ugliness. So, the Nazarite was like a light that God turned on amongst his people. And when they saw that Nazarite, that light would shine on them and they could see their own uncleanness. Now that was the main purpose of God. Through the presence of a Nazarite, he was rebuking the others. There is one thing of a servant of God preaching and preaching and preaching from the pulpit. Why do you think we have testimonies during a meeting? The testimony is to prove that there are people who are living according to the word. And in that sense, a testimony is a very powerful part of a meeting. Now, apart from a verbal testimony, your life itself is a testimony, a mute testimony. You don't have to speak. You're in your workplace and your friends are all behaving in a certain way. And when you are different, you become a light turned on. When you do not participate in what they do, and when you keep yourself clean, you don't take bribes, you don't indulge in obscene gossip, when you keep away from their parties and their worldly things, every time they see you, especially those who come from Christian backgrounds, they will be reminded of their own disobedience. You become like a Nazarite for them. Now that was the purpose of a Nazarite. God set a Nazarite among the people to show them how bad they were, to rebuke them. More than using words, he just put a Nazarite. Oh ho, all these people are rebelling. Right. Throw a Nazarite there. And the Nazarite who landed there, by his life, he would be like a light turned on. And the people began to see their corruption. That is why the Bible compares a Nazarite's life to snow and to milk in Lamentations 4:7. God compares the Nazarite to snow and to milk. What do we know about snow and milk? Both are pure white. It speaks of the work that God does in the Nazarite. So when he's like snow and he's like milk, and the people are all dirty, you can imagine, compare that white with their ugliness. Oh, that brought a terrible feeling in their hearts. Dear children of God, before I go into that Nazarite vow, I want to tell you something very important. These Nazarites, in particular Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, they were called to be Nazarites from birth to death, Nazarites for life. These Nazarites were not accidents. I told you, especially when you look at Samson and John the Baptist, even before their birth, God spoke to their parents and told them, now this is the kind of child I am going to give you. So you understand, this special Nazarite was pre-planned by God. He was not just an accident of creation. He was not just born because the parents planned to have a child. This was a gift of God. And not only was he a gift, God planned his future. And can you understand the risk that God took in giving such an important child to these parents? Can you then imagine what kind of parents would they have been for God to give this child to them? If they were another set of parents, they could ruin that child. But God gave this special Nazarite. He gave it to these parents. So what kind of parents were they? Let me now mention the three things about the Nazarite consecration. Yes, first of all, he had to keep away from wine and grape juice, wine and strong drink. No alcohol, no grape juice. Secondly, no razor would come upon his head, or he would never visit the hairdressers, never have a haircut. And thirdly, he would not go anywhere near a dead body. Now these are the three conditions of the Nazarite vow, and all the details of the Nazarite and all his consecration, the ceremonial cleansing and everything is recorded in Numbers chapter 6. I don't want to study that and turn this into a Bible study because this is a message. So I'm giving that to you. Numbers chapter 6 tells you all about the Nazarite consecration and how he has to live. Now, if this is such a special child, what kind of parents would this special child have? You will find that for the child to be a Nazarite, the parents also had to make a consecration for themselves. We began with Judges chapter 13 verse 5, which told us what kind of a child he would be. No razor would come on his head, and he would be a Nazarite from the womb. But now you read verse 4, the previous verse, which tells us what God spoke to the mother of this child. Judges 13:4.
Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing.
God told the mother, because your child is going to be a Nazarite, I am warning you, beware. Do not drink wine, do not drink strong drink, and do not eat anything that is unclean. You can see the mother keeping that consecration for her child. The same thing we see in the life of Samuel, because Samuel was called to be a Nazarite. Hannah had to come under that consecration. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 15, we see Hannah speaking to Eli the priest and saying, no, your daughter has not consumed any liquor. I have not touched any alcohol.
And Hannah answered and said, No, my lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord.
So we see the mother in particular had to enter a certain consecration. So the first part of this consecration of the Nazarite vow was this. While under the Nazarite vow, this person had to abstain from anything to do with alcohol. And for him to be so clean and so free, even the mother had to make that decision. Why? Because from the womb he was called to be a Nazarite. I was reading some medical papers and I found that some are claiming that alcohol has its uses. Alcohol is good. And I was going through these papers today, and there were some who claim that especially it is useful during pregnancy. I'm going to make some statements now. You can listen and you will realize how dreadfully wrong that is. In the year 1973, K.L. Jones, D.W. Smith and some of their colleagues, they realized that a substantial number of children whose parents whose mother had drunk alcohol during pregnancy, that these children who had been exposed to alcohol, it was prenatal exposure to alcohol, they exhibited a characteristic set of facial abnormalities, growth deficiencies, and psychomotor disorders. They named this characteristic covariance as fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS. Now, neurosurgeon Richard Carmona, he warned pregnant women to totally abstain from alcohol. Research on 2,000 mothers has found that the child will develop behavioral problems. Further research has linked prenatal alcohol exposure, that is, pregnant mothers being exposed to alcohol, it led to lower IQ levels in the children, learning and memory deficiency during adolescence. And in a meeting of the American Medical Association, they said that prenatal exposure to alcohol leads to a nerve cell death in the fetus. And also they have found that drinking alcohol during pregnancy leads to heart disorders for the child, ADHD, and myeloid leukemia. And they said when this mother consumes alcohol, it leads to the risk of an increase of 56% of myeloid leukemia. And published studies also have said that teenagers whose mothers drank during their pregnancy are far more likely, listen carefully, teenagers whose mothers drank alcohol during pregnancy are far more likely to consume alcohol, to succumb to alcohol, because they developed a taste for that alcohol in the womb itself. Once a family was going to church. They had a little boy in that house, and a very sweet little boy. And on their way to church, this boy suddenly blurted, he said, "I'm going to be a devil worshipper." The parents turned to him and said, What? What is wrong with you? Why are you behaving like this? And they thought this is just a one-off thing. But from that day onwards, this boy's behavior rapidly changed. He began to become very violent, and there were so many abnormalities in his behavior they couldn't understand. At the age of 19, he was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. The parents had to bear the blame for this disorder. Let us understand, long before these things were discovered, God has said in the scripture, for the sake of your child, you don't touch alcohol or even grape juice. How dangerous is any counsel that is contrary to that? But what was the result? What was the result when God set up Nazarites in Israel? What was the reaction of the Israelites? It's a very sad thing that took place in Israel. Every time a Nazarite walked into church, the other believers, they felt uneasy. Oh gosh, here comes Mr. Obedient. Here comes the Nazarite. And they didn't like to talk to him because every time they spoke to him, they felt convicted. Because they loved sin. They loved worldliness. They loved alcohol. They loved disobedience. They had their own ways. And every time they saw a Nazarite, it reminded them of their own disobedience. And the purpose of God of setting up these Nazarites was simply this. Look at his purity. Look at that snow. Look at that milk. Look how white it is. Now compare yourself with that. Now, you must become like him. That was the purpose of God in setting up these Nazarites there. But do you know what the Israelites did? Instead of allowing that light to shine on them to clean themselves, they chose to turn off the light. The Bible says that very clearly. If you turn to Amos chapter 2, verse 12, what did the Israelites do to the Nazarites? Amos 2:12.
But he gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and commanded the prophets, saying, Prophesy not.
You gave the Nazarites wine to drink. Instead of looking at the Nazarites and learning from their life, you have gone and defiled them so that you don't feel convicted anymore. You can imagine Sunday school children, 20 children, they gather together, and there is this one child who is different because he's a Nazarite. His parents have brought him up in a particular way. Now this is how you should be. And then he's learning now. Why don't you go and watch that? Why don't you learn in this? Who is teaching him? His friends are teaching him. Why? Because they want to make him part of them. You become part of me. You become like me. I'm bad. You also become bad. Then we can all be bad. That was what was happening in Israel, not among the children, but among the grown-ups. And God could see what a terrible, terrible thing they did. Dear children of God, whenever you see any believer a little better than you, be careful of the spirit of jealousy. The spirit of jealousy in us will try to defile them, to reduce their standard, to make them nothing, so that we can feel all calm now. I don't need to be convicted. But when you see someone better than you, God is speaking to you. When you see someone living a better life than you, God is speaking to you and saying, see, there is that better life. Why don't you try and become like them? But here they gave the Nazarites alcohol to drink. Let us not be carnal Christians who do not like a high standard, but let us seek to be like the Nazarites. Like the Nazarites, there was another family as well. They were called the Rechabites. The Rechabites, hardly heard of, hardly spoken of, but you read much about them in the Bible, especially in Jeremiah chapter 35. We read so much about the Rechabites. Who were these Rechabites? The Rechabites were all the descendants of a man called Rechab. And he was the son of Jehonadab. Now, Jehonadab was their grandfather, and Jehonadab was a very godly man. This very godly man, Jehonadab, he cared for his family, he cared for his children, and he cared for the grandchildren too. We do praise God for such grandfathers, such appachanmar, who care for their children and their grandchildren. You know, the presence of these elderly, fatherly people in that family and in the church is such a great blessing, because their influence is very precious. They teach their children and they teach their grandchildren the ways of God. They're called patriarchs. In the Bible we read of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as grandfathers. They didn't have to do anything as long as they were just there. Their presence was such a blessing. Think of our parents, think of our grandparents. When we think of their life and when we think of how they prayed, just the fact, it doesn't even matter if they're staying in the house, if they are alive in this world, the fact that they are there, it means so much to us. Why? Just for their love? No. Their being alive keeps something alive in us. And there is a fear. We have a fear for such parents. We have a respect for them. We don't want to hurt them. We don't want to grieve them. But what about their children and grandchildren who are the parents of today? Are we following their example? Sometimes we give counsel to our parents. You don't have to be so spiritual. They have lived all their lives as sacred people. And when they come to the age of 70, 80, we give them wine to drink. We give them something, a worldly counsel, and take them away from God. We have to be so careful. Looking at their lives, we have to learn from them. Now, Jehonadab was one such father. And this entire family were called Kenites, and Moses had actually married a Kenite wife. Now, what was the command that Jehonadab gave is what we understand in Jeremiah chapter 35. It's a very interesting chapter. God called Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is a servant of God. God called Jeremiah and said, Jeremiah, I want you to call all these people, the Rechabites, and bring them into a room. So Jeremiah brought them all into a room. And then God told Jeremiah, Jeremiah, I want you to set a big pot of alcohol in front of them. Now Jeremiah is a servant of God, and God told him, set a big pot of alcohol in front of them. So Jeremiah put that pot of alcohol in front of them. Then God told Jeremiah, now you command them to drink. Not give a counsel, you command them to drink. So Jeremiah did exactly that. In Jeremiah chapter 35, the first 5 verses we read it, and you just read verse 5.
And I set before the sons of the house of the Rechabites pots full of wine and cups, and I said unto them, drink ye wine.
Okay, now who is commanding? The servant of God, Jeremiah, commanded, drink wine. What was their reply in the next verse?
But they said, we will drink no wine, for Jonadab the son of Rechab our father commanded us, saying, we shall drink no wine, neither ye nor your sons forever.
Yes. Jonadab our father has said, you shall drink no wine, neither ye nor your sons forever. You shall drink no wine forever. Think of the situation. Jeremiah, the servant of God, is telling these believers, I am setting here a pot of wine before you. This is alcohol, the forbidden drink, but I am commanding you to drink. Just imagine, in their heart, there was the desire to drink, as there is in us. I'm not just focusing on alcohol. We know what alcohol spiritually means. It means worldly pleasure. The Bible tells us how Daniel in Babylon said, I will not drink wine. I will not drink alcohol. What is this alcohol? It speaks of worldly joy. That is why in Psalm 104 verse 15 we read about wine. It makes the heart of man glad. People drink for happiness. So generally alcohol or wine speaks of any worldly pleasure that can make us happy. So here Jeremiah sets this pot before them and he commands them to drink. Jeremiah does not know what God is teaching or what God is doing. Jeremiah imagines, I am commanding and they will obey. But Jeremiah was struck with a heavy blow on his face and said, sorry Jeremiah, we are not going to drink alcohol. I said, what? God, you commanded me and they disobeyed. God said, tell them again. He said, but I command you to drink. I said, you can command, but we won't touch it. Why? Because our father, Jonadab, the son of Rechab, he has told us we should not drink wine forever. Not us, nor our sons. Then, God, then why did you tell me to tell them? Okay, Jeremiah, the lesson is over. This lesson is not for them. This lesson is for you. I'm teaching you a lesson. And God took Jeremiah aside and said, have you seen them? Have you seen their faithfulness? How faithful they are? But look at all the other Judahites. how unfaithful they are. God was opening his eyes to this beautiful family of the Rechabites. He was opening Jeremiah's eyes and saying, see, amongst all the people, there is a group like this. How faithful they were. They were not Nazarites, but they were faithful in keeping to the command of their father. There were other commands he gave, but they are not the focus of our study today. So, this happened in Jeremiah's time. Dear children of God, it is time for us to think about our lives also. It's time for us to think about our children. God very clearly spoke, these children are special to me. They must not touch wine, and for their sakes you also must not touch wine. Dear parents, I'm not now speaking about literal alcohol. I'm speaking about general worldliness, worldly pleasures. Sometimes, for the sake of a happy home, we may think, I can bring some wine inside. And some parents will tell their children, look, I am big enough, I can enjoy it, but you can't. Some parents think that they have the right to say that. So the children are growing up thinking, okay, so my parents can do it, but I can't do it. Alright, so what age do I come up to till I can? Can you see the bad example? So for the sake of the child, as parents, you also have to keep away from that alcohol. That was the command of God to Manoah's wife, Samson's mother. You beware, because for the sake of your child, you must not. He is called to be a Nazarite from the womb. Dear children of God, we have a great responsibility. Our children are our responsibility. And God has taught you certain things. Deep in your heart you know. Therefore don't look to your left, don't look to your right, and don't say, other parents are doing this, other parents are doing that. Yes, other parents can do a lot. They can give wine to their children. They can give worldly pleasures to their children. But you are different. I told you how God taught my parents one particular thing. I know I've said this before, but I will repeat it, for it is very appropriate at this time. Because my parents somehow from childhood, when they joined this church, they had this revelation that they had to bring up the family with prayer faithfully. There must be prayer in the house, and there must be godliness in the house. Of course, you know, in India, there's no TV, there's no radio. Forget a computer. There was nothing there. And so the only pleasure we may have is probably with a chalk we draw something. We didn't know hopscotch, but we could do something and make up our own games and play. And that is the fun we had. And we were quite happy. But there was prayer in the house, there was discipline in the house, there was punishment. How many times I was beaten. And there was all this childhood discipline all through, because they had that revelation. But there was this point when we started asking for simple things. Those days, it was not a thing like, can we go and spend overnight with our friends? We didn't have that privilege. Can we go and watch that film? No, we didn't have that. Can we do this? Can we do that? It was very limited choice. You know, the only thing at that time, probably that was the best pleasure, was, can we go to the seaside? And my parents thought, what a harmless little joy that is. So, they had a very bad habit. You know what that bad habit was? They used to always ask counsel from servants of God. I'll tell you, that is such a precious habit that preserved them. There are some believers who are very spiritual. They're so spiritual, they don't need any counsel. Because they are the servants of God for their own families. They advise their children. They know everything. So they don't require any personal counsel. But my parents, they remain stupid and foolish because the Bible says the foolish people will not make a mistake. So they asked counsel. And at that time we had a pastor there called Pastor C. John. I'm not sure if you have even heard of him. He was a blind pastor. But a blind pastor who had eyes better than anyone else. I tell you, if you attended any of his meetings, you would attend only one meeting. Because you would not attend it the second time. You know why? He's a blind man. And he'll be preaching hard truths. And he will say, some believers, they drink alcohol. Huh? And they, Brother Matthew, isn't that true? And they'll get so stunned. They'll think, how did he know? And he will point in the right direction also. He'll know that person is sitting there also. They were all terrified of this pastor. He was blind, but he had eyes better than anyone else. And there was another pastor, Pastor Casey Varghese. He was called the prophet of the church. He was a man with a holy anger. If he stood up in the church, of course, he had to always adjust his clothes. And he will stand up. And he was a fair man. And he would turn into a tomato if he was angry. And they knew there's something coming. And he'll say, somebody in this church, you went this morning and you lit a candle on the grave of somebody. This meeting is adjourned. Until you stand up and confess. You have to confess your sin to the whole congregation. If you don't do it, I will confess your name. Just imagine if you attended a church like that. Those were the days. Now, servants of God are so soft. They don't say anything. We are being brought up in a nest of wool. When are we going to fly? My parents went to Pastor C. John and said, Pastor, can we take our children to the beach, Pastor? You know we don't do anything else like other families. That's all we are asking. He prayed and said, no, don't. Okay, Pastor. The okay was only with the mouth, but not with the heart. My mother came back home and she was so upset. What is this? What is wrong with this? Is there anything wrong? Anything wrong? It's only a little thing. That night she had a terrible dream. In that dream she was standing in the balcony of her house. And she was looking from the balcony on the streets and she could see a lot of children playing there. My brother was also there. And she was watching them playing. And as she was watching from the corner of her eye, she was distracted by some movement on the end of the street. So she turned and saw this man, and she always used to explain this to me. She must have told this about 1,500 times to me. To say, okay, now this is why we are so strict with you. This is why. I said, okay. I heard the story, now don't say it again. So this is probably the second time. So I will be only saying it another 1,498 times. And she said she saw this man. He's a very tall man. And he seemed to be a figure from the Arabian Nights. And he came. He was dressed in those garbs and with that pointed hat. And he had this wicked grin on his face. And he was tiptoeing towards the children, holding in his hand what looked like a test tube. A tall glass jar, and it had an effervescent, bubbly liquid at the bottom. And he was holding this, and my mother thought he was going to pass by. It's only as he approached the children, she realized he was slowing down and he was making for the children. And she thought, oh no. And then she realized he was scanning the children. He was looking for someone. And then his eye fixed on my brother. And as his vision was fixated on my brother, glued to him, he started making a beeline for him. Immediately my mother ran down the stairs. And those of you who have done some running in a dream, have you ever had an experience when you're running in your dream? How do you run? You run, you run, you run, but you never move forward. And the other thing, in a dream, you shout, and the voice never comes out. That's something in a dream, I don't know, it always happens to me. If I shout, no voice comes out. If I run, it's so slow. And here she was running and running and running, and she couldn't reach the gate in time. And as she came to the gate, she could see this man. He lowered that test tube or that glass jar, lowered it under his nose. He didn't put it to his mouth. He didn't say drink. All he said was, smell it. Just smell it. So my mother said, stop it, don't. But she was late. He just took a whiff, and that's it. And the next minute his eyes widened. Something happened, and he turned 180 degrees and started running away. And he ran and ran so fast, he was running like the wind. And all the while he was running, he was saying just one thing. It was his confession from his heart, and this was what he said. I do not want Jesus anymore. I do not want Jesus anymore. I do not want Jesus anymore. And my mother woke up. She was sweating. God, what is this? And the Lord said, all your child needs is not a taste, but a smell, and he will go away from me. And then she thanked God for the leaders who said no. Dear children of God, Jonadab very clearly said no, and the parents knew the answer was no. Let us also understand that our children are very precious. The second part of the consecration was they must not cut their hair or shave as a visible sign of their consecration. What does that mean? No razor shall come to his head. This razor, actually we know in St. Paul says, if a man does not cut his hair, what will happen? He will become have you read that verse? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4. Verse 14. 1 Corinthians 11, 14.
Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him?
If a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him. So when a Nazarite grew his hair, naturally it was a shame. When he made this decision, people began to reproach him. And people knew he was doing this for the sake of God. He refused what others were doing naturally. This speaks of a life of purity. Razor not coming to the head means not allowing any sin even to come to the mind. The way you bring up your children, you do not even want them to think upon sin. You do not want to expose them to anything that is no razor shall come upon his head. Why? Because his hair was his consecration. His hair was a crown, according to Numbers chapter 6 verse 7. God says his nazar is upon his head, or his consecration is upon his head, and it is his crown. There are other verses in the Bible which says that the crown is the nazar. Nazar is a crown. But what brings the crown down from the head? According to Lamentations chapter 5 verse 16, it is sin that makes us lose our crown. Lamentations 5:16.
The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned.
The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us that we have sinned. Sin makes us lose our crown. Dear children of God, no razor should come upon the head. We know that the razor came upon Samson's head because of sin. He lost his purity and therefore he lost his strength. So the second part of consecration is that the first part is no wine, meaning you have to be so careful about your house, about the way you bring up your children, and about your own life. I don't want any worldly pleasures. I don't want the joys of this world which others may do. I want to be careful. Then no razor, meaning nothing of sin must touch my child. I want my child to be brought up in purity as a Nazarite for Jesus. Remember, the standard of a New Testament believer is higher than the highest Nazarite. So our standard is higher. That is why St. Paul also taught in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 17 and 2 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1. He spoke about the standard of purity. 2 Corinthians 6:17.
Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you.
7:1.
Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God.
That must be your desire as parents for your children. I want my child to be pure for Jesus. And therefore I will make a decision for my own life. Thirdly, the Nazarite consecration was that he was not allowed to go anywhere near a dead body, because it would make him ceremonially unclean. Now, going near a dead body is probably the most difficult thing, because what if it was a loved one? What if it was his own father and mother? Even in churches today, although we say be careful, do not mix in worldly functions, do not go about here and there and participate in other parties and weddings and so on, when it comes to a funeral, we realize that there is a certain permit and people have to go. But the Nazarite was stopped even from that. Don't go anywhere near a dead body, meaning even for the sake of your relatives, do not defile yourself. Do not defile yourself even for the closest one, even if it is your relative. Can you see the standard that God imposed? And in that sense, his standard was stepping up to the level of a ruler or even a high priest by his consecration. Let us all think for a moment. Are we drinking alcohol? Are we allowing the razor to come upon our head? Are we defiling ourselves with dead bodies? When a Nazarite defiled his consecration, even if he has been a Nazarite for 20 years, the moment he defiles himself, there is a cleansing. It is possible for him to be cleansed. But the sad thing is, those 20 years would be cancelled and he would have to start all over again. Dear children of God, let us also make our decision. No wine, no alcohol, spiritually, no pleasures of this world, or that is, my soul or my heart should be kept clean. I don't want to enjoy what the world offers. Like Daniel said, no wine. I also want to say no wine. What Babylon offers me, I don't want to drink. Keeping the soul separate. Secondly, no razor will come to my head, or keeping my thought life, keeping my mind or my spirit clean. Finally, I will not go near any dead body, or there will be a separation even physically. So in the soul, in the spirit, and in the body, I want to be clean. I want to be a Nazarite for my God. Yes, truly, Jesus is coming back for those who are blameless. He's coming back for a Nazarite bride, a church who has kept her purity, for a group of believers who have understood this truth and embraced that truth. Therefore, dear children of God, you may find others doing things, but remember, others may, you cannot. God has called you with a different calling. God has called you with a special calling. Therefore, don't look to the left, don't look to the right. Look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith. He who has called you, he has spoken to you, and he has taught you. Therefore, as God continues to guide us, let us also care for our family, and let us all be prepared for that day when Jesus comes back for his Nazarite bride. Shall we stand?